implementation of recommendations of UN treaty bodies or political bodies of human rights is an important issue in Germany as in any other country as well. And as in any other country, there's more or less political hesitation. I would say that some issues are easier than other issues. When it comes to education, it's perhaps a bit easier to implement recommendations by the Child Rights Committee than when it comes to ill treatment by police officers, which is not really comfortable in any country, as I think. What I think is really important to have in mind is that implementation is nothing that happens on one special day. Like there's a committee giving a recommendation to Germany, and then on the other day, Germany would implement it, and then everything is fine. That's not how it works. Usually it's a really long process, sometimes taking weeks, sometimes taking even years, for an implementation actually taking place after a human rights body has given a recommendation. And it's also important to be aware that it needs many actors besides the government itself. It needs an active civil society, NGOs who really closely follow what's happening in Geneva with recommendations from there and how the government actually implements this in law or in practice. It needs a constant dialogue. It needs media, journalists who are aware of what's going on and to follow an issue and to realize that it needs media coverage for a government to actually get going on a specific issue. And it needs the UN treaty bodies and the other human rights organizations to follow up on what the respective government is doing. So this is important to have in mind, and this is basically true for any other country as well. Of course, it's important that civil society and NGOs in a country can actually do their work and are not confined by legal regulation, repression in any other form. When it's forbidden to criticize the government for their non-implementation of UN legal standards, then you can't do your job as civil society. If you risk to get imprisoned for that, then it's really dangerous to do that job. But that then, having a civil society organizations being able to do their job is usually part of human rights treaties that the country ratified. So, given that there is a civil society, it needs active involvement for them to do. When we speak about implementation of human rights issues in Germany, it is important to distinguish between those human rights bodies which are of a political nature, the Human Rights Council, for example, and the treaty bodies, which have a more legal nature, as they are based on the specific international human rights conventions that have been ratified by more or less states. Like, for example, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights is an international treaty. Each state that ratifies this treaty commits itself to implement the rights of this treaty on its state territory and to ensure that all these rights are guaranteed to its own people. And the bodies who observe the implementation of the international conventions are the so-called treaty bodies. And for the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, it's the Human Rights Committee, or for the Convention on Enforced Disappearances, it's the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, the Anti-Torture Convention, it's the Committee on Torture, and so on. So when these treaty bodies issue or adopt at the end of a state report or a state investigation their concluding observations or views on individual complaints, for example, these are legally binding recommendations or calls to a state for specific action. And these are legally binding insofar as they are based on an international obligation that the state committed to implement by ratification of that treaty. So if the state ratifies the Convention Against Torture, this means the state cannot do it just for fun or to become friends with their international neighbors and have a good reputation internationally. They do that, or they should do that, because they actually want to improve the situation in their respective countries and to raise the legal standards and legal protection for their own citizens and people who live on their territory. And this is, of course, not really comfortable in all cases because it requires change. And when you, for example, look at police, the practice of police code of conduct, how police officers do their work, how they adhere to the law that is relevant for their practice, then it's, of course, it's a bit difficult for the state, but because the state depends on police officers to enforce their state authority. But at the same time, they have to make sure that the police officers do their work according to the law. So the obligations from the international conventions, and then the observance or the work the treaty bodies do, shouldn't be seen as something which is uncomfortable and just to be done because, international community wants it. Because there's a real commitment to bring about change in your own society. And of course, it doesn't happen within one day and another. It needs time. And this is the case for Germany as well. In Germany, various treaty bodies have called on the German government to establish, for example, independent complaint procedures in cases of ill treatment by police officers. So if there's a demonstration out of the street and police officers act with disproportionate violence against citizens, then it is your right as a citizen to complain. But if there is no body or person you can go to complain to, then something is wrong. So this was a recommendation made, or it has been made to Germany from various committees, the Human Rights Committee, the Committee Against Torture, and of course it's part of the UPR process of the Human Rights Council as well. So there is a legal obligation for Germany to make sure that ill treatment by police officers doesn't take place. Now we have the problem in Germany, not a problem, we have the situation in Germany that the police is organized at the federal Länder, the so-called Länder level. We have 16 independent Länder where the Länder government, the federal governments are responsible for the police, and then we have the federal police. So they have to have something that is at least comparable on all these levels. And it's difficult because one land says, we want to do it this way, and the other one says, we want to do it that way, and so on. So then Amnesty International, for example, some years ago did a campaign on identification of police officers. They called for police officers, which are out on the street, have to have a name tag or a number, because a name tag might be a bit difficult for them, but a number, something that makes sure that if there's a complaint, the person, the police officer, can be identified, because that has been a serious problem. So there was a campaign by an NGO. There have been a couple of legally valid recommendations from UN treaty bodies. There also have been rulings from the European Court on Human Rights, which, of course, Germany, as a member of the European Convention or state party to the European Convention on Human Rights, there's another level of obligation as well. So there have been a couple of incidents working together over a period of, let's say, less than 8 to 10 years. And by now, a couple of länder already have in their legal provisions that police officers have to wear a number, some kind of identification possibility. A couple of lenders have established ombudspersons or complaints officers or procedures to investigate allegations of ill treatment in a more serious way than before. Not all of them are as independent as the recommendations called for, but it's a step. And with one or two federal lenders going ahead and establishing that, it becomes more common for police officers to wear these tags. So it's a process, and it's really important that all those actors work together. But it's really important that the recommendations from the treaty bodies are seen as they are, as highly authoritative calls to a government to implement what they are legally obliged to do. To give you one example from Germany, in a sphere that is not really legal binding in legal terms, but political binding, which is the UPR process, the Universal Periodic Review, that each country, each UN member state has to undergo every 4.5 years. Germany as well, Kazakhstan as well. Germany was under review in 2018 for the 3rd time. So it's a bit 2.5 years now since then. And civil society asked the German government to do a midterm review to report what has happened and how they have implemented the recommendations out of the Universal Periodic Review. And the government said, well, no, we have to do so much reporting, we won't do this. We will do another report when the 4th Universal Periodic Review is coming up. But, of course, we're willing to discuss with civil society how we performed over the last 2 years. So it's kind of a compromise, and civil society in Germany is taking this very seriously. Civil society, the human rights organizations are organized in a Forum Menschenrechte, which is a network of 50-something organizations. And they compiled a midterm review from the civil society perspective. We looked at all the recommendations that were given, or most of the recommendations that were given to Germany, and wrote down what was and how those are implemented or not, or to what stage they are implemented. And the Forum Menschenrechte, this network, will have a meeting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and other ministries are invited as well at the end of October, and then we will discuss it. And there are issues in this in these recommendations which have a really close connection to recommendations from the treaty bodies as well. Just to give you one example, the issue of racial profiling is a very serious issue in Germany and quite a lot of attention in the media as well. It's about police officers asking or questioning people just because they are black or have another color or might have a migration background or whatever. So there's no real incident that made them ask those people, but you know, they can do it. The police law allows this practice. The Minister of Interior says, no, this doesn't happen in practice. We don't have a problem with that. And when there's a little problem, we take care of it. Civil society says, there's a real problem of that. And then we have a lot of incidents and we documented that. And we have a lot of UN treaty bodies, the Committee Against Torture, the Committee on Human Rights, the Committee on Racial Discrimination, the Working Group on Racial Discrimination and People of African Descent. They all gave recommendations over the last years to Germany to look into this police law, which allows this practice, basically. And there are a lot of recommendations from treaty bodies, so legally binding, highly authoritative recommendations, and also political recommendations as from the UPR process. And these recommendations have been in the second cycle relevant as well. So by now, we have a problem with racial discrimination and hate crimes in Germany, which has gone up very much. We have much more attention in media coverage and a higher awareness in the broader public that there is a problem. And by now, the Minister of Interior is under serious pressure not to say any longer that there is no racial profiling, but to allow a closer study into the practice of the police, what's going on there. And for now, he still says, no, I don't want it. But the pressure is becoming higher and higher. And now, just recently, a week ago, the government admitted, okay, we will do a study and investigate closer about racial discrimination in the broader public. This is a fairly bad compromise because the police is not just part of the broader public. The police is a legal institution of law enforcement officials, so there is a much higher obligation and responsibility. So civil society says this is not enough, we have to do more about that. Government at the moment says, well, there's some movement, but not really. And I explain this because it's a good example of what I mentioned in the beginning, that it takes some time, it takes the civil society, it takes the media coverage, it takes a broader awareness of a problem within the society going on. And it needs the international attention. And this is why it is so important that all this goes together and works together and in the end will bring about change. I'm pretty sure that a year from now, we will have more official studies about racial profiling within the German police, and some kind of changes in practice, and perhaps even in the law that regulates this kind of practice. Just one other example, which is a more legal one and has hardly any public attention in Germany, is the recommendation or appeal, call to the German government to to establish a criminal offense of enforced disappearances in Germany. Well, now you would say, well, there's no real case of enforced disappearances in Germany. Why do we need it? We do need it because Germany ratified the Convention Against Enforced Disappearances in 2010. And by ratifying a convention, the state legally commits itself to implement the rights that are stated in this convention on its territory for all people who live on that territory. So the convention, as a couple of other rights, states that each state party has to make sure that in its national law there's a provision that enforced disappearances is not allowed, is criminally liable, and that there will be investigations, that there will prosecutions in cases of enforced disappearances, and that the prison terms that might follow a judgment will reflect the seriousness of this crime. Germany says, well, we have all kinds of these offenses in our law. We have murder, and we have abduction, and we have kidnapping and trafficking, and we have all this in our law. But all these single crimes do not, in combination, reflect the seriousness of the crime of enforced disappearances. And although, fortunately, this is not a real problem in Germany, Germany is obliged to implement this part of the convention. They reported this in their first state report after ratification of the convention. Then the committee said, well, we are not satisfied with that. Can you please implement, or can you please adopt a criminal or establish a criminal offense in your national criminal code as the convention requires you to do so, and as you are legally obliged to do so. And then they said, well, within, I think, 5 years or so, please send another report and describe how you proceeded in the meantime. This report was due in March this year, and the German government said, well, we have thoroughly considered this, and we are still of the opinion that it's not necessary because we have all those single crimes in the law, which in combination allow for investigation and prosecution should a case of enforced disappearance happen in Germany. Legally, you can argument in such a way. And as there are at the moment, no known cases of enforced disappearance, okay, it might be, okay. And that's, of course, the reason why it's not so high on the agenda of civil society and not at all of the agenda of the media. But there have been cases in the context of the US war on terror and secret places of detention in Europe. There have been 2 cases which would have fallen under the convention if the convention would have been in place by that time already. So it's not completely out of our mind that it might happen in Germany, and that's why it's so necessary. And now there are at least 2 cases of high-ranking military officers from Argentina and Germany who were involved in serious crimes of enforced disappearances in Germany. And as they have the German nationality as well, they found a way to live in Germany and nobody can do something about it because the legal provisions are not there. I don't want to say that with this if Germany would have this criminal offense as the convention requires, you could actually investigate against these Argentina military officials. But here it becomes a political issue. If Germany wants to be a serious state party of the Convention Against Enforced Disappearances and a relevant political actor fighting worldwide against this crime, and basically politically they are doing this, but where is their credibility if they A, do not implement an obligation from the convention, and B, do not investigate and prosecute people who live in Germany who, yes, they have the German nationality and can't be surrendered to Argentina, but then you have the obligation to investigate in Germany, and they don't do it. So it's a wrong political signal. And by now, as there are cases, and phases, the media becomes more attentive to this issue, and we can see some pressure increasing on this, and this will hopefully lead in the end to the government saying, okay, so for political reasons, it is important that we fulfill our legal obligations from this convention and establish such a criminal offense in the German criminal code as well. What I have explained now about the processes that are necessary and the actors that are necessary to bring about change with regard to obligations from international human rights treaties is, of course, true for a country like Germany, where there is a civil society that can work almost unhindered, where there is free media, where you have a broad coverage, although not as much as awareness about international processes as the civil society would like, but nevertheless there is all this. In countries where this is not the case, where civil society cannot go out and send a press release about the government not implementing recommendations from treaty bodies from Geneva without risking their the closure of their organization or the imprisonment of their staff or any other reprisals, then of course it's more difficult. And if you don't have a free media in their country and no journalist who dares to publish something critical about the government that might be responsible for ill treatment of police officers or low standards in social care, for example, which is also regulated by international conventions, then the situation, of course, is much more difficult. But as I said before, it's not only civil society and media, it's also the parliament, the national parliament or the regional parliaments, even the communal parliaments or like assemblies of cities or districts or so. They can make a difference if they are aware of international obligations, and that's often very difficult. So it needs awareness raising measures, it needs training and so on, and of course it needs the political will of the government. If there's no political will of the government as well, then it's even more difficult, of course. But then it's more important than ever that there is international observance, that the treaty bodies don't shy away to follow up, that they again and again raise their recommendations, ask for dialogue with the government, that they issue press releases. This has happened before as well. And that besides this UN level, also international cooperation or international contacts with other governments, like the German, there's some exchange between the German and the Kazakh parliament, that the German parliament raises these obligations. And of course there's some kind of responsibility of civil society in Germany, who some of them have connections to Kazakhstan, make sure that when there's a delegation from the German parliament going to Kazakhstan, that they raise the implementation of this obligation or another obligation, or that they really poke their fingers into that wound, and that they raise questions when they are there, and that they really do not look away, but raise these issues. Because in the end, what's most important about all this, each state that ratifies an international convention, as I said before, doesn't do it just for fun. They either do it because they really want to bring about change for their society, or they do it because they want to enhance their international reputation, and that they can say, yes, here we have ratified that treaty and that treaty, and so on. But this reputation won't really increase if they don't implement it. And in the end, this is the longer way, and this will take probably more time for real change to take place in that country. But from my experience, it will bring about change, because no state, neither Russia, nor China, nor the US, being them as big as they are, no state likes it to be discredited for their international human rights performance by other states. And the real proof of my thesis is, I think, the Universal Periodic Review in Geneva, because there all states have to undergo this review, and until now we are on the third cycle. No state has. Israel tried once, South Africa in the very beginning tried to find another way, but in the end no state until now really escaped this scrutiny, and all of them tried to present themselves as best as they can. And this shows, I think, that all of them want to look as good as they can, and this is the hook. And if it's not the national civil society and not the national media, then it's the international civil society and the international media and the international community who has the responsibility to actually look what's going on and to raise their words when something is not developing in a way as it should.